It started on a dirt airstrip near Nahanni Butte in the southwestern Northwest Territories in June 1980. A Canadian military transport plane, 28 wood bison crated in Alberta, and a boreal valley that had not held a wild wood bison in over a century. By 2017, the population data was telling a story nobody on the original recovery team had seen coming. Survival was the baseline. Breeding came next. Neither was the headline. The herd was colonizing territory the program had never targeted, establishing satellite populations in 3 Canadian jurisdictions hundreds of kilometers from the release site, reorganizing meadow systems that had been running without a mega herbivore since before the First World War, and doing it on its own terms. Human releases ended decades ago. What the bison are now doing to the boreal landscape is the part that scientists, by their own admission, still cannot fully explain. Here is the whole record, from the colonial slaughter that erased these herds, through the 45-year gamble to bring them back, to what the population data is now revealing about how a single returned species can reshape an entire boreal valley. Most coverage of wood bison reintroduction starts with a release clip and ends 3 minutes later. This one stays with the herd through 4.5 decades of survey data into the founder bottleneck, the predation losses, the First Nations conflicts most conservation narratives ignore, and the scientific evidence only now emerging about what happens to an ecosystem when its largest land mammal returns after a 100-year absence. The sourcing throughout is the Kosewik Stotis Report on Wood Bison, the Northwest Territories population surveys, and peer-reviewed research in PNAS and Ecosphere. None of this is theory. It is what the field record confirms. To make sense of what the bison are doing now, the disappearance has to come first, and the chain of decisions that made bringing them back one of the most improbable wildlife gambles in North American history. The wood bison is not the buffalo on the US nickel. It is North America's largest land mammal. An adult bull weighs over 2,000 pounds. Its shoulder height reaches nearly 6 feet, the heaviest land animal in the Western Hemisphere. In motion, those broad shoulders and the massive hump of muscle over the forequarters make every other animal in the boreal, moose included, look small. It can plow through snowdrifts deeper than its own legs, using only its head and shoulders. Its broad, low-slung head is built for sweeping frozen forage in conditions that would starve any other large herbivore on the continent. Females form matriarchal herds, where calving grounds and migration routes are passed from mother to daughter, walked across the same meadows for generations. Once a herd establishes a wallow site, those depressions persist in the soil for decades, holding rainwater long enough to support amphibian breeding cycles in otherwise dry boreal terrain. What makes the wood bison irreplaceable is the dual role. It grazes, it builds, it crops grasses by sweeping its head low across the meadow floor. It tramples standing dead vegetation back into the soil. It carves wallows that fill with rainwater and become micro-wetlands. And critically, it deposits nitrogen-rich dung distributed across thousands of square kilometers, recycling boreal soils that would otherwise lock up nutrients for decades. That combination makes the wood bison something larger than a grazer. It is an engineer that opens the boreal forest to the meadow species that have nowhere else to live. What happens when that function returns to a boreal valley that has spent over a century without it is something the data documents in detail later. Northern Canadian wildlife managers had not seen numbers like the ones that came in. Before any of that, the story of how Canada lost them. A century without wood bison on the boreal floor is not just a missing herd. It is a missing engineer, and Canada removed that engineer deliberately. Beginning in the mid-1800s, as the commercial hide trade pushed northward, the wood bison was classified as a resource to be cleared. Hunters were hired, herds were tracked, hides were stripped, repeating rifles were issued to commercial crews, a method so efficient that a single team could empty a valley in a single season. By the early 1900s, only about 250 wood bison survived in all of North America. Canada established Wood Buffalo National Park in 1922 to protect them. Then between 1925 and 1928, the same government transferred 6,673 plains bison directly into that last refuge, and by the 1940s, biologists had declared the pure wood bison extinct. What followed was nearly 20 years of nothing. Canada's next move took 45 years to play out. It hinged on the accidental survival of a herd everyone assumed was extinct, and it came close to never starting at all. In 1957, a Canadian Wildlife Service researcher named N.S. Nowakowski, flying a routine aerial survey over a remote corner of Wood Buffalo National Park, spotted a small herd of roughly 200 bison along the Nahanni River. They were larger than the hybrid bison, their humps higher and more squared. They were 160 kilometers from the nearest hybrid herd, separated by terrain that had prevented contact for decades. Testing confirmed it. These were wood bison, disease-free, the closest thing to pure stock still alive on the planet. Canada had its own donor population. It just had to keep it alive long enough to use it. Every step from this point on was deliberate. 18 Nearling bison were captured in 1963 for the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary, and 21 more were taken to Elk Island National Park in Alberta in 1965. They were fenced, quarantined, and managed as a closed genetic arc for the entire subspecies. When the Elk Island herd had grown enough to spare founders, 28 animals were crated, flown by Canadian military transport, and released into the Nahanni Valley. It was chosen because its boreal meadows, mineral licks, and riparian flats along the Liard River provided exactly what wood bison need to feed, calve, and overwinter. Phase 1 was a single release in June 1980. 28 bison out of the crates. What followed was a wait, because 28 is a perilously small founder population, and a single hard winter or wolf surge could erase the experiment before the herd reached reproductive momentum. Walking out of the crates was never the question. Building a population was. 8 months in, the data already showed behavioral patterns scientists had expected to need years to develop. In 1981, Northwest Territories biologists monitoring the Nahanni herd documented engineering activity at full intensity. The bison were already grazing meadows down to the soil, wallowing in depressions that filled with rainwater, and trampling willow thickets along the Liard floodplain. It was the first sustained wood bison engineering on Canadian soil since the early 1900s. Almost exactly a century. It read like a coincidence written for television, but aerial survey and ground observation confirmed every detail. By 1989, the herd had grown enough that wildlife managers added 12 more bison from Elk Island, not to rescue the population, but to broaden its genetic base. The Dene communities of Nahanni Butte and Fort Liard watched the recovery unfold from their own land. The bison were visible from the highway. Researchers, biologists, and northern photographers came to document them. As the herd expanded, the same sequence repeated everywhere. Bison moved in, researchers and visitors followed, and the surrounding landscape began adjusting to the return of a megafauna species that had not walked it in living memory. The herd's situation was anything but secure. The same diseases that doomed the original wood bison in the 1920s, tuberculosis and brucellosis, still circulated in the hybrid herds of Wood Buffalo National Park, kept geographically separated from the disease-free Nahanni population only by distance. Disease spillover remained the greatest long-term threat to the reintroduced subspecies. Anthrax outbreaks killed dozens of bison across northern Canada in the 1990s and again in the 2000s. Wolf predation thinned juvenile cohorts in heavy snow winters. Vehicle collisions on the Alaska Highway killed individual animals. Adverse weather battered calving rates across multiple seasons. The threats were not the headline. Where the surviving bison started turning up was, by the late 1990s, the original 28 had grown into a herd that ranged well beyond any boundary the biologists had predicted, and the science was unambiguous. The Nahanni release alone could not anchor a continent-wide subspecies recovery. A second round of releases was unavoidable. The second wave of Canadian reintroductions ran from the late 1980s through the 2000s and changed the strategy. Rather than keeping new releases concentrated in the Nahanni system, federal and territorial governments established founder herds across the Yukon's Aishihik area, the lower Mackenzie Valley, and the British Columbia border country, spreading the geographic base so that no single disaster could wipe out a concentrated subspecies. Within the Nahanni system itself, 12 more bison were added from Elk Island in 1989, and 59 more north of Fort Liard in 1998, bringing the total Nahanni founder count to 99. Every projection got revised upward. By 2000, the Nahanni herd had passed 200 animals. By 2017, when the most recent comprehensive aerial survey was completed, 962 bison ranged across 10,000 square kilometers, an area larger than Yellowstone National Park. By every published metric, including survey count, range expansion, and demographic trajectory, the recovery had become one of the most successful large mammal reintroductions documented in northern Canada. Kosewik, the federal authority on wildlife status, had already downgraded the wood bison from endangered to threatened, the first improvement in the subspecies' federal status since the assessment system began. And then, the further releases tapered off. No more flights from Elk Island. The crates on the dirt strips were behind them. The military transports flying founders into the boreal had made their last delivery. From here on, the wood bison of the Nahanni Valley are running themselves. From here, the recovery stops being predictable. The survey numbers describe more than a surviving population. They describe a population making decisions the founder effect models did not anticipate and triggering ecological changes that scientists are still working to measure. Start with the geography. The program released bison in the lower Liard Valley near Nahanni Butte, but the herd's descendants are now holding territory and carving in regions that were never release sites. The Liard River, a wide, cold, powerful northern waterway that biologists had treated as a natural barrier, turned out not to be one. Wood bison crossed it on their own, swimming bank to bank in episodes wildlife researchers documented with a mixture of astonishment and concern, and established a permanent population in northeastern British Columbia, in habitat that no human had selected for them. The expansion path was the bison's to choose. They chose well. The government of the Northwest Territories, in coordination with British Columbia and the Yukon, has confirmed that wood bison from the Nahanni founder lineage now hold territory across 3 Canadian jurisdictions, a geographic spread covering more than 10,000 square kilometers of boreal forest, river valley, and alpine meadow, and demonstrating the kind of autonomous range expansion that marks a genuinely self-sustaining population. Geography was only the first finding. What the bison were doing to the ecosystem itself sat in a different category. Wood bison do not occupy a landscape passively. They are disturbance-dependent megafauna that sit at the center of a food web connecting grasses, soil microbes, amphibians, waterfowl, and the predators that follow grazing herds. A century without them, and the systems they had built started drifting. Open meadows succeeded into closed forest. Wallow depressions filled in and stopped collecting rainwater. Soil nutrient cycles slowed without the redistribution of nitrogen-rich dung. Those drifts solidified into the new baseline. Now they are unwinding. In the Nahanni Valley, meadow systems along the Liard corridor are being maintained by an animal that was doing this job for thousands of years before it was removed. Wallows are filling with rainwater again, and the amphibian and arthropod communities that depend on those micro-wetlands are returning to spaces they had not occupied in living memory. What the bison are doing is not a return to some imagined pristine state. It is the reintroduction of a process, a function, that had been absent for more than 100 years. Peer-reviewed research published in PNAS in 2022 by Ratachchak and colleagues found that bison reintroduction nearly doubles native plant species richness, an effect exceeding the combined impact of fire management, mowing, and cattle grazing. The full scale of that benefit has not been quantified yet. 45 years of population and habitat data from the Nahanni herd represents one of the longest-running large herbivore restoration datasets in northern North America. What it reveals about megafauna engineering and the recovery of disturbance-dependent ecosystems is still being analyzed, but the trajectory is unmistakable. The third finding was cultural. Nahanni Butte, a Dene community most travelers had never heard of, became a destination because of the bison. The Liard Valley pulled in researchers from across North America. Inside Wood Buffalo National Park, the recovery of the wood bison reinforced the criteria that had already secured the park's UNESCO World Heritage status. The economic and cultural case for megafauna reintroduction, usually contested as an abstraction in the years before a project starts, solidified the moment the first calves were visible from the highway through Nahanni Butte. In Dene, the wood bison is Iji. The word outlasted the animal. For more than 100 years, Dene speakers carried that word without a herd it could refer to. The rivers and meadows of the Liard Valley held the name of an animal that no living person in Nahanni Butte had seen on the land. The animal has returned. The word has its referent back. The wallows being carved into the boreal soil, some inherited from herds that disappeared a century ago, deepened with each generation that returns, will keep collecting rainwater long after the current bulls have died, supporting amphibian breeding cycles that no other northern engineer can sustain. By the precedent of other northern bison populations, some of those wallows could persist for decades, for generations, 45 years, 28 founder animals, a subspecies declared extinct in 1940, rediscovered by chance in 1957, airlifted from a genetic ark in 1980, and a population that is now writing its own future across the boreal north without anyone opening another crate. Canada is not the only country where a returned species is rewriting a landscape in ways no one modeled in advance. In our next video, we go to Idaho, where in 1948, a state wildlife officer threw 76 live beavers out of an airplane with surplus World War II parachutes, dropped them into a valley that would become one of America's largest protected wilderness areas, and accidentally started an ecosystem restoration experiment that has been running for 77 years. 28 bison reshaping a boreal valley sounds dramatic, until you see what 76 parachuting beavers did to 2.3 million acres of American wilderness when nobody was watching. Your default picture of ecosystem recovery is about to change.